I had to teach myself early on, expect to fail. Expect it.
There's a moment Sylvester Stallone has described more than once in interviews, sitting alone in a studio office, reading a trade magazine that listed him as Hollywood's biggest liability. Not a fading star, not a box office risk, a liability. The man who had once sold out theaters in 40 countries, who had created two of cinema's most enduring characters, was being discussed like a bad investment someone needed to write off. He didn't throw the magazine across the room. He didn't call his agent in a rage. He sat there and read every word, because somewhere beneath the fury, he knew they weren't entirely wrong. And that quiet, humiliating admission to himself in a room nobody else saw is where this story really begins. To understand what Hollywood did to Sylvester Stallone in the 1990s, you first have to understand what Hollywood had made him in the decade before. By 1985, Stallone occupied a position in American culture that no actor had held quite like that before.
Try my best to, but can't you see I'm working?
He wasn't just a movie star. He was a symbol. Rocky Balboa had given working-class America a mirror to hold up to itself, and they'd loved what they saw. John Rambo had become the walking embodiment of an entire nation's unresolved feelings about Vietnam, betrayal, and forgotten soldiers.
Guns with knives, with his bare hands. In Vietnam, his job was to kill, period.
Two characters, two franchises, both built from nothing by a man who'd been rejected so many times that the story of his own persistence became almost as famous as the films themselves. The facts of how Rocky got made had become Hollywood legend. Stallone, broke and unknown, had written the script himself in 3.5 days. Studios offered to buy it with the condition that a real star would play the lead. Ryan O'Neal, James Caan, Burt Reynolds. Stallone refused every offer, every time, insisting on playing Rocky himself or not selling at all. The gamble paid off in ways that reshaped the industry. Rocky won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1976.
Rocky, Irwin.
Stallone became only the third person in Oscar history to receive nominations for both Best Actor and Best Original Screenplay in the same year. What followed was a decade of dominance that barely seemed real. Rocky II, III, and IV. First Blood and Rambo. First Blood Part 2, which earned over $300 million worldwide in 1985 alone, making it one of the highest-grossing films ever made at that point. Cobra, Tango and Cash. Demolition Man. By the end of the 1980s, Stallone commanded a per-film salary of $15 to $20 million.
Did you ever have an inkling of having this kind of success?
Oh, no, not at all. I didn't think that
His name above the title was considered a guarantee. Theaters filled. Merchandise sold. The world bought what Sylvester Stallone was selling without hesitation. Then the 1990s arrived, and Hollywood changed the rules without telling him. The shift didn't happen overnight, which made it harder to fight. If someone had walked into Stallone's office in 1990 and told him his career would be effectively dismantled within 3 years, he would have laughed. The numbers didn't support it yet, but the culture was already moving. A new kind of action star was rising, one who didn't grunt through his pain or bleed through his victories.
I'll be back.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had always been Stallone's chief rival, made a hard pivot with Terminator 2 in 1991, leaning into irony and spectacle in a way that felt fresh. Bruce Willis had repositioned himself as an everyman hero with a sense of humor. And then, in 1994, a former television comedian named Jim Carrey earned $20 million from a single film and rewrote the entire conversation about what audiences wanted to feel when they went to the movies.
Austria! Well then, good day, mate.
Action heroes who took themselves seriously were suddenly embarrassing. The very quality that had made Rocky and Rambo resonate. Their earnestness, their emotional weight, the fact that Stallone played these men as though their pain was real, became something audiences were trained to find ridiculous. Sincerity went out of fashion. Self-awareness became the currency of cool. And Stallone, who had built his entire identity on believing in what he was doing, found himself holding a currency nobody wanted to spend. He tried to adapt. This is the part of the story that gets overlooked because it's easier to laugh at the failures than to recognize the impossible position he was in. Adapting meant abandoning the very thing that had made him. It meant playing against type, undercutting his own image, performing ironic distance from characters he'd spent a career convincing audiences were real. And when he tried, it came out wrong. Stop, or My Mom Will Shoot arrived in 1992, and it did something no box office flop had done to Stallone before. It didn't just fail. It became a punchline. The film had looked manageable on paper, a comedy playing on the contrast between a tough cop and his smothering mother, with Estelle Getty providing the laughs. But what reached theaters was something confused and tonally incoherent, a film that wasn't funny enough to work as comedy and wasn't serious enough to work as anything else. Critics eviscerated it. Audiences stayed home. The box office numbers were a humiliation by any measure. But the true damage wasn't in the numbers. It was in the tone of the response. Entertainment reporters didn't write serious analysis about what had gone wrong creatively. They mocked him. Late-night monologues ran with it. The film appeared on worst of lists not as a cautionary tale about miscasting, but as evidence of something much crueler, that Sylvester Stallone was out of touch, washed up, and slightly ridiculous for not knowing it. He'd made bad films before. Hollywood understood bad films. What they didn't forgive was looking desperate and somehow stop. Or, My Mom Will Shoot carried that scent. The man who had refused to sell Rocky without playing the lead himself, who had once had all the power in every negotiation, now looked like someone trying too hard to stay relevant. In Hollywood, there is no sin more unforgivable than that one.
I knew that all the baggage I bring with me as a character and the roles I've played, people wouldn't buy me being...
The studios noticed the shift in how the media was talking about him, and one by one, quietly and without ceremony, they began stepping back. What Stallone has admitted in interviews, in fragments, in careful language, in moments where the professional composure slips just enough, is that the betrayal wasn't loud. Nobody called him in to tell him the party was over. There was no confrontation, no meeting, no honest conversation about what was happening. There was simply a growing silence. Phone calls returned later. Projects that had been discussed in enthusiastic meetings quietly disappeared from development. Scripts that arrived were noticeably different from the ones that had been sent 5 years earlier. Smaller budgets, weaker supporting casts, concepts that felt like second choices. The machinery of Hollywood is designed to be indirect in its rejections. Nobody says you're done. They just slowly stop calling with the opportunities that matter. Stallone has spoken about this period with a specificity that makes it clear how deeply he paid attention. He described watching projects move forward without him that he had been promised. He described the particular vertigo of reading a film announcement and recognizing it as something that had been in development with his name attached just months before. The industry didn't owe him explanations. That was the brutal part. It simply moved on, and he was left to figure out what that meant. The financial dimension of this rejection was real and serious. Stallone had spent with the certainty of a man who believed the machine would keep producing. The houses, the collections, the overhead of a life built at the top of an industry. None of it was designed for the income of someone whose career was in freefall. He found himself, as he later acknowledged, in a position that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. A man who had once commanded $20 million per film, having genuine conversations with his accountants about what he could afford to keep. The public mockery compounded everything else. This is the dimension of Stallone's 1990s that tends to get minimized because mockery seems small compared to professional collapse. But the sustained, systematic nature of what the entertainment media put him through in that period was something different from ordinary bad press. Magazines ran comparative cover stories about the new generation of action stars alongside unflattering retrospectives on the old ones. Critics who had once taken his work seriously began reassessing his entire filmography through a lens of condescension. The Golden Raspberry Awards, the so-called Razzies, celebrated his failures with the enthusiasm that crossed the line from criticism into cruelty. He won or was nominated for multiple awards in the same year, not in competition with other films, but as a singular target. He absorbed it publicly with the same stoicism that had always been part of his image. In interviews from this period, you can watch him carefully choosing words, offering professional answers while giving nothing real away. What he has admitted since, in the years when enough distance had accumulated to speak honestly, is that the mockery reached him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd been criticized before. He'd made peace with the reality that not everyone would take his work seriously. But there is a difference between criticism and the particular brand of contempt that Hollywood turns on someone it has decided to discard, and he felt every bit of that difference. The question that haunted him, as he's described it, wasn't whether the critics were right about specific films. Some of those films deserve criticism. The question was why the industry that had benefited so enormously from his success felt so comfortable treating his decline as entertainment. The personal toll of those years operated quietly beneath the professional collapse. Stallone was going through his second divorce during this period, ending his marriage to Bridget Nielsen, having already navigated the end of his marriage to Sasha Zack. He was raising sons from his first marriage, managing the complexity of a fractured family life, while simultaneously trying to rescue a career that seemed to be slipping through his hands regardless of what he did. He has spoken, rarely and carefully, about the isolation of that period. Fame creates a particular kind of loneliness, surrounded by people whose proximity depends on your success. Watched constantly, but rarely seen. When the success wavers, the people who had surrounded you begin making calculations you can feel but can't quite name. The entourage thins. The enthusiasm in rooms changes temperature. Stallone had built an identity around being the underdog who fought his way to the top. What he hadn't built was a clear sense of who he was when the fight was going badly and nobody was in his corner rooting for him to win. There was also the specific pain of watching his own legacy being reduced. Rocky and Rambo, which he had created, which bore the marks of his specific vision and his genuine investment, were being referenced as artifacts of a simpler, more naive era rather than as the genuine achievements they represented. He couldn't separate his feelings about that from his feelings about himself. He had put too much of himself into those characters for the distinction to mean anything. What he didn't do, and this matters, is disappear. He kept working. The films that emerged from his 1990s, Judge Dredd in 1995, Daylight in 1996, Copland in 1997, were uneven in their results, but consistent in his effort. Copland in particular showed something that his critics had spent years insisting he didn't have: genuine dramatic depth, a willingness to be unglamorous, to play someone weak and flawed and fully human. He gained 60 pounds for the role. He worked alongside Robert De Niro, Harvey Keitel, and Ray Liotta, and held his own. The film was a critical success. Nobody much cared. The narrative about Stallone had calcified. Copland got filed away as a footnote rather than a turning point, and the industry moved on again without pausing to reconsider what it had decided about him. The realization, when it finally came, didn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It was slower than that, more complicated. Stallone has described a gradual process of understanding that the version of Hollywood he had known, the one that had taken his impossible gamble on Rocky seriously, that had built franchises around his specific qualities, that had paid him $20 million because they genuinely believed in what he could deliver, that version was gone. Not temporarily, not in a way that strategic choices could recover. Gone in the way that eras go, replaced by something different that operated according to different values. That understanding could have broken him. For a period, it nearly did. But somewhere in processing it, he reached something he'd later describe in interviews with a clarity that suggested it had cost him something to arrive at it. He realized that what Hollywood had done to him in the 1990s was not personal. It was industrial. The studios hadn't turned on him because they discovered some truth about him that proved their earlier investment wrong. They turned on him because the market changed and he hadn't changed with it fast enough, and in Hollywood, slow adaptation is the only crime. That realization didn't erase the anger or the pain or the years of humiliation, but it gave him somewhere to put it that wasn't entirely consuming. The vindication, when it finally came, arrived in a form that felt almost scripted for maximum irony. Rocky Balboa in 2006 brought him back to the character that had started everything.
But it ain't about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. How much you can take and keep
And
moving
instead of the
forward.
mockery the announcement initially generated, the film landed as something genuine and earned. Critics who had spent a decade dismissing him found themselves disarmed by a performance that was quieter and more honest than anything they'd expected. Then the Expendables franchise rebuilt his box office credibility on his own terms, gathering the generation of action stars who had partly replaced him and positioning himself as their elder statesman. And then Creed in 2015 did something extraordinary. It returned to the Rocky universe and placed Stallone in a supporting role, a choice that many assumed would feel like a demotion and instead felt like a revelation. His performance as an aging Rocky Balboa, sick and tired and human in ways the earlier films had never allowed, earned him a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination. The industry that had spent years mocking his decline watched him, in his late 60s, deliver the most critically praised performance of his career.
Time I hear, I was 1977. I was kind of hit by tumbleweed. It was been a long time ago. It was like a different situation.
He didn't gloat. He has never been the kind of person who gloats, which is one of the qualities that gets overlooked in the familiar narrative about him. What he did do, in interviews around that period, was speak more openly about the 1990s than he had at any point before, about what it felt like to be systematically dismissed, about the specific cruelty of an industry that treats people as assets until they aren't, and then moves on without a backward glance. He said that he had learned more about himself in the years when nothing was working than in all the years of success combined. That failure has a clarity to it that success never quite manages. That the version of himself who had sat in that studio reading that trade magazine, being called a liability, had needed to sit there and feel that particular feeling before he could understand what he actually wanted and why. At 78, Sylvester Stallone has outlasted the critics, the trade magazine assessments, the Razzie ceremonies, and the industry consensus that once treated him as yesterday's news. He is at work on projects that generate genuine anticipation rather than skeptical headlines. He has built a family life that he speaks about with a warmth that suggests it has become the most important thing he has. More important than box office numbers. More important than the opinions of people who decide what Hollywood values in any given decade. What he carries from the 1990s isn't bitterness. It's something closer to a hard-won education. He knows now that an industry's assessment of your worth has very little to do with your actual worth, and that surviving the gap between those two things is the only test that really matters. The man who refused to sell Rocky without playing the lead, who sat in rooms with studio executives who thought he was making a terrible mistake and held his position because he believed in himself when nobody else did. That man never actually disappeared in the 1990s. He just had to wait out a decade that didn't have room for him yet. The strange thing about Sylvester Stallone's story is that the Hollywood that discarded him didn't win. He did. Not because the redemption came or the awards arrived or the critical reassessment finally caught up with the reality. He won because he was still standing when the decade ended, still working, still believing in what he was doing with the same stubbornness that had walked into a negotiation over Rocky and refused every compromise. Some people are built for winning when the conditions are right. Stallone has always been built for something harder than that. He's built for not quitting when every signal around him is telling him to stop. That's not a movie character trait. That's just who he is. And Hollywood, in all its wisdom, spent an entire decade forgetting it. If this story moved you the way Stallone's resilience moves us, consider subscribing to Timeless Hollywood, where the real stories behind the legends are always the most compelling ones of all.